Synopsis: The Instinct's Warning. In the arid interior of Texas, where silence is broken only by the wind and the distant sounds of wildlife, lives Ethan Walker, a solitary man who found in his German Shepherd, Ranger, more than a dog. He found a loyal and attentive companion. Together, they walk trails, take care of the small property, and face the harsh routine of the American countryside. On an apparently ordinary morning, during a walk through an area of dry brush and hot stones, an invisible danger draws near. A rattlesnake, perfectly camouflaged, prepares an attack that could be fatal. What Ethan does not notice, Ranger perceives in seconds. Driven by an ancestral instinct and unshakable loyalty, the dog acts without hesitation, placing himself between his owner and death. The confrontation changes everything.
What begins as a routine walk turns into a desperate fight for survival, revealing how far an animal's courage can go when it loves its human. Throughout the story, we follow not only the moment of the attack, but also its physical and emotional consequences. The race against time, the fear of loss, the strength of the bond between man and dog, and the gratitude that is born when life is preserved by an act of pure instinct and love. Chapter 1: Hot Ground and Silence. The sun had not yet reached the highest point in the sky when Ethan Walker left the house. In West Texas, mornings began early, before the heat turned the air into something too heavy to breathe. The land was dry, cracked, covered with low shrubs and stones that seemed to store the heat from the previous day. It was a beautiful place in its own way, harsh, silent, and unforgiving. At his side walked Ranger, a German Shepherd of imposing build, dark coat, and alert gaze. The dog moved naturally, as if that territory were part of his own body. His ears remained upright, catching sounds Ethan would never perceive. Ranger did not walk out of habit. He patrolled, observed, evaluated. Ethan trusted that. After his wife's death, that isolated piece of land had become refuge and prison at the same time. Ranger was the link that kept him grounded.
More than companionship, he was constant, silent, faithful presence. He never barked without reason. He never looked away without cause. They followed an old trail, once used years earlier to drive cattle. The wind dragged fine dust along, and the distant sound of insects broke the silence. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Ranger stopped. It was sudden. A step suspended in the air. The rigid body, the muzzle low, sniffing something invisible. Ethan noticed nothing at first, only found the abrupt change in the dog's behavior strange. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, taking another step forward. Ranger growled low. A contained, tense sound, unlike anything Ethan had ever heard from him. It was not aggression. It was warning. The ground, covered with dry leaves and stones, seemed harmless. But there, among shadows and accumulated heat, something moved without hurry, perfectly camouflaged, waiting for the exact moment. Ethan did not yet know it, but that would be the last instant of tranquility before his life and Ranger's changed forever.
Chapter 2. The sound of the rattlesnake ranger's growl did not stop. On the contrary, it grew deeper, vibrating in the dog's chest like an ancient, almost primitive warning. Ethan felt a chill run up his spine. In all those years living there, the German Shepherd had never reacted that way without real reason. Ethan stopped walking. The wind blew stronger, making the dry leaves move across the trail. Then, a sound cut through the silence. A dry, fast, threatening rattle. The sound did not come from far away. It was close, very close. Ethan recognized it immediately. Rattlesnake. His heart raced. He tried to locate the source of the sound, but the ground looked like a mosaic of stones, branches, and shadows. There was no visible movement, only the snake's insistent warning, defending its territory. Ranger stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself between his owner and the danger.
The dog's body was tense, muscles rigid, eyes fixed on a specific point to the left of the trail. There, between two sun-warmed stones, something moved slowly. The triangular head appeared first, cold, motionless eyes. The thick body coiled with perfect precision for the strike. The tail vibrated, producing the sound that echoed in Ethan's ears like a death alarm. "Ranger," Ethan whispered, his voice faltering. "Easy." But time seemed not to obey human commands. The rattlesnake drew its body back in fractions of a second. Ethan tried to step backward, but his foot slipped slightly on the loose dust. The movement was enough to trigger the attack. Ranger reacted before any thought could form, a quick, precise leap, an impulse driven by instinct and loyalty. The dog lunged at the exact moment the snake projected its body forward. The impact was violent, the dry sound of fangs striking flesh mixed with Ranger's abrupt bark. The rattlesnake was thrown aside, but not without leaving its mark. Ranger fell onto the hot ground, whimpering low. Ethan felt the world spin. The snake retreated, disappearing among the stones. Silence returned, heavy, suffocating. Only the sound of the dog's labored breathing broke the air. Ethan knelt beside Ranger, his hands trembling. In the middle of the dust and heat, he saw two small red marks on the German shepherd's leg. Reality struck like a blow. Ranger had been bitten.
Chapter 3. The Invisible Venom. For a few seconds, Ethan remained motionless, as if his body had forgotten how to react. The sun continued to shine, indifferent to what had just happened. The wind blew hot, and the world went on as usual, except there, at his feet. Ranger was breathing with difficulty. His chest rose and fell too fast, and a low whine escaped his throat. The German shepherd tried to stand, but the bitten leg failed, causing him to fall back onto the dry ground. "Hey, stay with me, boy," Ethan said, kneeling beside him. His hands shook as he examined the dog's leg. The two marks were swelling rapidly, the surrounding skin taking on a reddish, tight tone. Ethan knew what that meant. Rattlesnakes did not strike as a warning. When they bit, it was to truly injure. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear his own thoughts. The pickup truck was parked almost 2 kilometers away. The cell phone had no signal in that area. Every minute lost was the venom's silent advance through Ranger's body. The dog slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting his owner's. There was no panic there, only exhaustion and trust. "You saved me," Ethan murmured, his voice breaking. Ranger tried to move his tail, but his body no longer responded as before. His breathing became irregular, and a slight tremor ran through his hind legs. Ethan felt a knot form in his chest. He had faced droughts, losses, and loneliness in that place, but nothing had prepared him for the idea of losing Ranger. Without thinking further, Ethan slid his arm under the dog's chest and tried to lift him. Ranger was heavy, heavier than ever. Even so, he managed to get him on his feet, supporting him against his own body. Every step was an effort. The trail seemed longer now, the sun more cruel. Time merciless. Behind them, hidden among stones and shadows, nature resumed its silence.
Ahead, there was only a desperate race against something unseen, but already inside Ranger's body, advancing without haste. Ethan quickened his pace. He would not lose the dog who had just saved his life.
Chapter 4. Every step counts. Ranger's weight seemed to increase with every meter they crossed. Sweat ran down Ethan's face, mixing with the fine dust the wind lifted from the ground. The sun was higher now, merciless, turning the open land into a furnace. The trail that once felt familiar had become endless. Ranger limped heavily, leaning more on Ethan's body than on his own legs. The bitten limb was visibly swollen, the rigid muscles revealing pain he endured in silence. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not cry out. He simply kept going, trusting. "Hold on just a little longer," Ethan repeated, as if words alone could keep the dog standing. Ranger's breathing grew heavier. At times, his body sagged suddenly, forcing Ethan to stop. Every pause felt like an enemy. Ethan knew the venom spread faster with exertion, but there was no alternative. Stopping meant giving up. The countryside remained painfully silent, broken only by uneven footsteps and the harsh sound of the dog's breathing. No cars, no houses, only dry earth and an endless sky. Suddenly, Ranger stumbled and collapsed onto his side. Dust rose as his body hit the ground, and for a few terrifying seconds, he didn't move. "Ranger!" Ethan shouted, dropping to his knees. The dog's eyes were half closed now. His tongue hung slightly from his mouth, and the tremors in his legs had worsened. A raw, paralyzing fear took hold of Ethan, the kind that strips thought down to desperation. He pressed his forehead against Ranger's, breathing with him, as if he could lend him strength. "Not now, please." With effort, Ranger tried to move. That small gesture reignited something inside Ethan. He inhaled deeply, slid his arm beneath the dog's body once more, and pulled him upright. Ranger stood, unsteady, trembling, but alive.
Far ahead, almost lost in the heat shimmer, Ethan saw it, the silhouette of the pickup truck reflecting sunlight. Never had anything looked so distant or so vital. Ethan pushed forward again. Now, every second decided everything.
Chapter 5. The Body's Limit. The pickup truck seemed to retreat as they advanced. Sunlight reflected off the metal like a cruel mirage, deceiving Ethan's exhausted eyes. His legs burned, his arms screamed from supporting Ranger's weight. The German Shepherd could no longer steady his hind legs. The swelling had spread, creeping upward. His breathing was short and irregular, each breath a battle. Still, Ranger did not resist. He didn't struggle, he simply accepted Ethan's support. "I'm here," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Then Ranger let out a faint whimper. The sound struck Ethan like a blow. He stopped, gently lowering the dog to the ground, his heart racing too fast. Ranger's gums had turned pale, and the alert light in his eyes was beginning to fade. Ethan knew what it meant. The venom was advancing, compromising vital functions. Every minute without help increased the danger.
He pulled off his shirt, folded it tightly, and improvised a compress above the wound. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. Ranger reacted with a slight movement, but did not resist. The silence around them was suffocating. No signs of help, no human sounds, just the vast, indifferent land. Then Ranger's body gave out completely. His legs folded beneath him, and he collapsed, breathing shallowly. Panic surged through Ethan. "No! Stay with me!" he pleaded, his voice breaking. Without thinking, he made a risky decision. He slid his arms beneath Ranger's body and lifted him onto his shoulders, pain shooting through his spine. Every step became a physical sacrifice, but he didn't stop. The truck was close now, very close. The engine would mean the difference between life and death. Ethan moved forward, even as his body screamed for him to quit. He wasn't carrying just a dog. He was carrying the life that had just saved his own. Chapter 6. Race Against Time. Ethan nearly collapsed when he reached the pickup truck. The sun-heated metal burned his hands as he opened the rear door, laying Ranger carefully across the seat. The German Shepherd's breathing was so faint that, for a moment, Ethan feared it was already too late. "Hold on, just a little longer," he whispered hoarsely. He turned the key hard. The engine roared to life, and dust exploded behind the truck as it surged forward down the dirt road. Every bump made Ranger's body shift slightly, and each movement tightened the knot in Ethan's chest. The phone screen read, "No service." Ethan tossed it onto the seat in frustration.
The nearest town was nearly 40 minutes away, 40 minutes that felt like a lifetime. Ranger's eyes opened briefly. They were dull, distant. The tremor ran through his body, followed by a barely audible whine. Ethan reached out, steadying the dog's head. "You're strong. Not now," he said, forcing calm into his voice. At last, asphalt appeared ahead. Ethan pressed the accelerator harder, ignoring the speedometer. Hot wind tore through the open window. Every second felt stolen from the clock. Ranger's breathing faltered. Then, silence. Ethan's heart stopped. "Ranger?" he called desperately. A weak sigh followed, enough to keep hope alive. In the distance, a road sign announcing the town emerged like a miracle. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. There was still a chance. Small, fragile, but real. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. There was no room for mistakes. Ranger's fight was not over yet. Chapter 7. Between Glass Doors. The pickup truck screeched to a stop in front of the small veterinary clinic. Ethan jumped out before the vehicle had even come to a complete halt, running to the door with Ranger in his arms. The bell above the entrance rang far too loudly at that critical moment. "Please, he was bitten by a rattlesnake," he shouted, his voice heavy with desperation. The receptionist looked up and, seeing the condition of the dog, immediately called for help. Within seconds, 2 people appeared with a stretcher. Ranger was carefully placed on it and quickly taken down a narrow hallway, illuminated by cold white lights. Ethan tried to follow, but a firm hand stopped him by the shoulder. "We're going to take care of him," said a veterinarian, looking straight into his eyes. "I need you to wait here." The glass doors closed with a sharp sound. The silence in the waiting room was almost unbearable. The air smelled of disinfectant, and the clock on the wall marked each second with cruelty. Ethan sat down, his hands still dirty with dust and sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Images of the attack returned to his mind without warning. Ranger's leap, the impact, the sound of the fangs, the brutal certainty that the dog had placed himself there to protect him. Minutes dragged on like hours. From time to time, a shadow passed behind the frosted glass. No words, no answers, only waiting. Ethan closed his eyes, resting his head against the cold wall. He had never been a religious man, but in that moment, he made silent promises to anything that might be listening. "He didn't deserve this," he murmured. The bell rang again when someone opened the inner door. Ethan stood up immediately, his heart racing. The veterinarian appeared, her expression too serious to offer immediate comfort. "The bite was severe," she said. "The venom was already advanced when you arrived." Ethan held his breath. "Is he going to survive?" The veterinarian hesitated for a second that felt eternal. "We're doing everything we can. The next few hours will be decisive." Ethan nodded slowly. On the other side of those doors, Ranger was fighting, and for the first time since the attack, Ethan could not fight for him. Chapter 8. The Longest Hours. The waiting room seemed smaller with every passing minute. Ethan paced back and forth, unable to remain seated. The sound of the clock hammered at his thoughts, marking an invisible countdown he could not ignore. On the other side of the wall, Ranger fought for something he did not fully understand, but accepted with the same loyalty with which he had always accepted everything. Ethan remembered the first time he had seen him, still a puppy, trembling inside a transport crate. Since then, he had never truly been alone. The exam room door opened briefly. A nurse rushed out, carrying medications. The tense expression brought no comfort at all. Ethan tried to ask questions, but no one had time to answer. He sat down again, burying his face in his hands. The image of the red marks on Ranger's leg returned insistently. 2 small wounds that had unleashed chaos impossible to contain. "You saved my life," he whispered. Guilt mixed with gratitude. If he had been more attentive, if he had stopped sooner, if he had noticed the danger. But nature gave no clear warnings. Ranger did. The hours dragged on. Outside, the sky slowly darkened, and the clinic lights grew even harsher. The loneliness of that place made him remember other waits, other losses. When the door opened again, Ethan jumped to his feet. The veterinarian emerged, carefully removing her gloves. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but also something different. "He's stable for now," she said. The antivenom worked, but his body was pushed very hard. Ethan felt immediate relief, followed by fear. "Can I see him?" The veterinarian nodded. The room was quiet. Ranger lay there, connected to tubes, his chest rising and falling slowly. Ethan approached, gently touching the dog's head. "I'm here, buddy." Ranger's eyes opened for a second. A nearly imperceptible movement of his tail confirmed what Ethan needed most at that moment. Ranger was still fighting. Chapter 9: The Price of Survival. Dawn advanced silently inside the clinic. The lights remained on, casting long shadows through the empty hallways. Ethan stayed seated beside Ranger, refusing to leave, even when rest was offered to him. The German Shepherd was breathing more regularly now, but his body remained fragile. The injured leg was wrapped in bandages, and slight swelling was still visible. The venom had been controlled, but not without leaving marks. The veterinarian explained everything carefully. There would be pain. There would be weakness, possibly temporary after effects. The immediate danger had passed, but the road back would be slow. Ethan listened in silence, holding Ranger's paw as if it could anchor him to reality. Every word was a mix of relief and concern. When they were alone again, Ethan spoke for the first time in hours. "You didn't have to do this." Ranger slowly opened his eyes, blinking with effort. The look was still tired, but it recognized his owner. A low sound escaped his throat, almost a sigh. The sun began to rise through the window, painting the room in orange tones. A new day, a new chance. Ethan remembered life before that place, the losses that had brought him there. Ranger had appeared when everything seemed too empty to go on. Now, he had almost lost him. The thought made him shudder. He ran his hand carefully through the dog's fur, feeling the living warmth beneath his fingers. Ranger gently moved his tail, just enough to make Ethan smile, for the first time since the attack. The recovery would be long. Short walks, medications, constant vigilance. But Ranger was alive. Ethan lowered his head, resting his forehead against the dog's. "We'll get through this together," he promised. Outside, the world continued at its normal pace. People came and went, unaware of the silent drama that had unfolded inside. But for Ethan, everything had changed. The life Ranger had saved now needed to be lived with more attention and gratitude. Chapter 10: The Way Back. The pickup truck moved slowly down the road, as if respecting the fragility of the one inside. Ranger lay on the back seat, wrapped in blankets, his body still weak but alive. Each breath felt like a small victory. Ethan drove in silence. The sound of the engine was steady, almost comforting. He checked the rear-view mirror every few seconds just to confirm that Ranger was still there, that none of it had been a nightmare. The veterinarian had been clear. Absolute rest. Medications at the correct times. No long walks. No exposure to heat. The land that had always meant freedom now represented risk. When they arrived at the property, the sun was beginning to set. The simple house looked different, smaller, more vulnerable. Ethan parked and carefully opened the back door, helping Ranger down. The dog leaned on him, hesitant but determined. Inside the house, Ethan prepared a space near the window where the light came in softly. He placed fresh water, adjusted the blankets, and sat beside him, watching every movement of the dog's chest. Silence once again filled the space, but now it carried a different weight, It was no longer loneliness. It was vigilance, constant attention. Ranger opened his eyes and fixed them on Ethan for a long moment. The look asked for nothing. It was simply there, present. "I should have noticed," Ethan said quietly. "I should have been more careful." Ranger let out a soft sound, almost a grunt, as if disagreeing. His tail moved slowly, touching the floor. Ethan smiled, despite the pain still lodged in his chest. That night, he did not sleep. He stayed beside the dog, listening to every breath, every small movement. The fear of losing Ranger was still there, but now it was shared with something new: gratitude.
The same land that had almost torn them apart had brought them back together.
Chapter 11. Old Scars. The early hours of the morning moved slowly inside the house. The dim light of the lamp cast soft shadows on the walls, while Ethan remained seated beside Ranger. The dog slept restlessly, his body still reacting to the effects of the venom. Small, involuntary movements made Ethan hold his breath, alert to every detail. Sitting there, with nothing but silence and the sound of the dog's breathing, old memories began to surface. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and found himself years earlier, in a different hospital, watching machines beep around a bed he could not save. His wife had been taken in the same cruel way, too fast, without enough warning to react. Since then, Ethan had learned to live with the idea that some losses were inevitable. Ranger had been the exception, the only being who had made him believe again in care, routine, and purpose. He leaned forward and ran his hand over the German Shepherd's head. Ranger slowly opened his eyes, still heavy but attentive. His gaze met Ethan's, steady, as if recognizing that silent pain. "I thought I was going to lose you too," he confessed, his voice thick. Ranger let out a soft sound, almost a sigh. His tail moved slightly, just enough to respond. It was not human comfort, it was presence. Ethan took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. Not out of despair, but from accumulated relief. The tears fell silently, mixing with the gratitude growing in his chest. The pain of loss had never disappeared. It had only learned how to hide. Now, in front of that wounded dog, it surfaced again. Not to destroy, but to remind him of what still mattered. When the day began to brighten, Ranger fell into a deeper sleep. His breathing was more stable. The immediate danger seemed distant. Ethan leaned back in the chair, exhausted, but at peace. Some scars never fully close. But others appear to remind us that there is still life and reasons to protect it. Chapter 12. The First Steps. Dawn brought a different air, cooler, calmer. Ethan opened the window slowly, letting the light in without startling Ranger. The German Shepherd was still sleeping, but his posture was different, less rigid, less tense. When Ranger finally opened his eyes, he tried to move. The gesture was slow and careful, as if his own body were relearning its limits. The injured leg trembled, but did not completely give out. "Easy," Ethan said, moving closer. Slowly. With effort, Ranger managed to support himself and sit upright for a few seconds. The simple achievement filled the room with silent hope. There were no celebratory barks, just a steady, determined look. Ethan followed every instruction to the letter. Medications at the correct times, fresh water always available, no direct exposure to the sun. He followed every small sign of progress as if it were a personal victory. Mid-morning, a distant sound caught Ranger's attention, a faint rustling coming from outside. His ears lifted instinctively, and his body stiffened for a second. Ethan noticed immediately. No, not yet. Ranger tried to stand again, ignoring the pain. The protective instinct was still there, intact. Ethan held him gently,
preventing the sudden movement. "You've already done more than you should have," he murmured. Outside, the field remained the same dry earth, the same invisible dangers. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest as he realized how much that simple routine now carried risk. Recovery would not be only physical. Both of them would need to relearn how to trust that environment. Ranger lay down again, breathing deeply. The effort had tired him far too quickly. Ethan stayed beside him, attentive. Every step, every movement, now required care. Survival had been achieved, but the path back to normalcy was still far from over. Chapter 13. The Echo of Fear. The afternoon's silence was broken by a dry sound coming from the yard. It wasn't loud, nor prolonged, but it was enough to make Ethan's body react instantly. He stood up on impulse, his heart racing. Ranger noticed it too. His ears rose, his alert gaze fixed on the direction of the door. His body tried to move before reason allowed it. The injured leg responded with an unstable tremor, drawing a restrained whine from the dog. "No," Ethan said firmly, moving quickly toward him. The sound repeated itself, something dragging between stones, the same type of noise that had preceded the attack days earlier. Fear, still fresh, returned with full force. Ethan closed the door carefully, locking it. His hand was sweaty on the doorknob. He knew he couldn't allow another risk. Not now. Maybe never again. Ranger insisted on trying to stand, ignoring the discomfort. The protective instinct spoke louder than pain. Ethan knelt in front of him, holding his head with both hands. "It's over," he murmured. "I'll handle this now." The sound stopped suddenly. Silence returned, heavy and tense. After a few minutes, Ethan dared to look through the window. It was only a large lizard, slowly crossing the yard. Relief came accompanied by something unexpected. Guilt. He realized he no longer had the same confidence in the place he called home. Every shadow now seemed like a threat. Every noise, a warning. Ranger lay down again, exhausted. The effort had taken its toll. Ethan brought water, adjusted the blankets, and sat beside him. The fear had not disappeared, but something had changed. This time, Ethan had not been paralyzed. He had reacted. He had protected. Perhaps that was the true legacy of Ranger's sacrifice, teaching him that courage could also be learned. And as the sun began to set, Ethan understood that surviving did not mean merely escaping death. It meant learning how to live differently afterward.
Chapter 14. Rebuilding Trust. The following days passed at a different pace, slower, more attentive. Ethan adjusted his entire routine around Ranger as if the world could wait. Walks were limited to the fenced yard, always under constant vigilance. Ranger improved little by little. The leg still responded with stiffness, but it could bear weight for longer periods. The light in his eyes began to return, accompanied by small gestures that reminded Ethan of who he had always been. Ethan observed each improvement in silence, without exaggerated celebration. He had learned that recovery required respect. Hurry was now the enemy. One morning, Ranger walked a few steps on his own toward the shade of the porch. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Ethan truly smile. Not from relief, from pride. "Good boy," he said softly. The field remained the same. The same hot ground, the same distant sounds. But Ethan no longer saw it the same way.
He had learned to observe, to listen, to stop before moving forward. Ranger sat beside him, leaning his tired body against Ethan's. There was no fear in the gesture, only trust. The same trust that had driven him to throw himself in front of the snake. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. For the first time since the attack,
He allowed himself to imagine the future without that constant tightness in his chest. Maybe they would never return to the old trails. Maybe they would change their habits. But they were together, and that was enough. As the sun began to tilt in the sky, Ranger lay down again, exhausted but serene. Ethan remained there, watching the horizon. Trust was not rebuilt all at once. It was made of small steps, exactly like the ones Ranger was beginning to take again.
Chapter 15. Recognition. The white pickup truck stopped in front of the fence late in the morning. Ethan found the visit unusual. Few people came out there without notice. Ranger, lying in the shade of the porch, immediately lifted his head, alert, but did not stand up. The clinic's veterinarian stepped out of the vehicle, accompanied by a man wearing the county animal control uniform. Ethan walked to the fence, his heart racing out of reflex. "We came to see how he's doing," the veterinarian said, smiling when she saw Ranger. "And also because his story has traveled farther than you might imagine." Ranger tried to get up. Still cautious, he managed to stand, relying more on his good leg. The man watched in silence, impressed. "Few dogs survive a bite like that," he commented, even fewer while protecting someone in the process. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. He had never thought of what Ranger did as something extraordinary. To him, it had simply been Ranger being Ranger. The veterinarian approached, crouching beside the dog. She checked the leg, the reflexes, the response to stimuli. Her expression was satisfied. "He's strong," she said. "Very strong." The county officer explained that cases like this were recorded. Stories of animals saving human lives rarely went unnoticed. There were people who needed to hear that, who needed to remember what loyalty could mean. Ethan listened in silence. Ranger sat down beside him, leaning his still tired body against his owner's leg. The simple gesture said more than any words. "He didn't do it to be recognized," Ethan said at last. "He did it because it was what needed to be done." The man nodded. "That's exactly why it matters." When the truck drove away, silence once again took over the place. Ethan looked at Ranger and smiled softly. "Looks like you've become a hero, boy." Ranger moved his tail slowly, indifferent to labels. For him, the world was still simple. Protect the ones you love. Chapter 16. Echoes Beyond the Fence. Ranger's story began to spread quietly, almost shyly. First among the clinic staff, then among town residents. Someone mentioned it to someone else. Someone shared a simple account. Within a few days, people Ethan had never seen before began passing along the road in front of his property. Some just waved. Others stopped for a moment. They wanted to know if the dog was okay. They wanted to confirm if the story was real. Ethan didn't like attention. He never had. But he noted something different in those curious faces. It wasn't sensationalism. It was respect. Ranger spent most of his time lying in the shade, watching in silence. Sometimes he lifted his head when he heard new voices. His tail moved slowly, without exaggerated enthusiasm. He was still recovering. One afternoon, a mother stopped with her young son. The boy watched Ranger with attentive eyes. "Is that the dog who saved you?" he asked, without fear. Ethan nodded. "He protected me." The boy smiled, impressed. Ranger carefully stood up and took a few steps closer, allowing the child to observe him up close. There was no force in the gesture, only trust. "He's a hero," the boy said, convinced. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Maybe that story wasn't only about survival. Maybe it was about reminding people that courage doesn't always make noise. When afternoon turned to evening, actor Ethan sat beside Ranger on the porch. The field stretched out in front of them, as silent as always. But now there was something different in that silence. Connection. Ethan had spent years distancing himself from the world. By saving him, Ranger hadn't only protected him physically, he had reopened a door Ethan had kept closed. He ran his hand over the dog's head. "Looks like you saved more than one life, boy," Ranger lay down beside him, exhausted, but at peace.
Sometimes, a silent act crosses invisible fences and changes far more than a single destiny. Chapter 17. The Choice. Night fell peacefully, bringing a clear, star-filled sky. Ethan remained seated on the porch, watching Ranger sleep beside him. The dog's breathing was calm now, his body finally sinking into a deep and well-earned rest. That silence was no longer empty. It was reflective. Ethan thought about the past few years, about choosing to live in isolation, far from people, far from bonds that could hurt again. He had always believed the countryside offered him safety, control. But the truth was different. Life had never been predictable. Not there, not anywhere. Ranger had acted that day by instinct, yes, but also by something greater. Loyalty, presence, simple, direct love. Ethan realized he had spent too much time trying to avoid loss, when what truly mattered was being willing to protect, and to be protected. The next morning, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and called the veterinarian.
Asked about follow-up care, light physical therapy, regular evaluations. Then he contacted an old friend from town, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. "I'm thinking about showing up more," he said, feeling the strangeness of his own voice. Ranger watched everything attentively, as if he understood that something had changed. Ethan decided they would no longer walk the isolated trails. He would build better fences, create a safe space, adjust his life to what truly mattered. When he knelt down to pet Ranger, he felt something different. Not fear, not guilt, responsibility. "I promise," he said softly, "I'll take care of you the way you took care of me." Ranger moved his tail slowly, satisfied. He didn't need long promises, only constant presence. Sometimes, surviving isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a conscious choice about how to live afterward. Chapter 18. The Final Test. The veterinarian had recommended a small test, nothing risky, just a few minutes outdoors in a controlled area to evaluate how Ranger responded to effort. Ethan prepared everything with excessive care, like someone determined not to make the same mistake twice. The yard was silent, fenced, safe. Even so, Ethan's heart beat faster than it should have. Ranger walked slowly, feeling the ground beneath his paws with renewed attention. The injured leg responded well in the first steps. There was stiffness, but no failure. The body seemed to remember, little by little, how to move. Ethan watched without interfering, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of trouble. Ranger stopped, took a deep breath. The air seemed to carry memories. For a moment, Ethan feared the return of fear, but it didn't come. Ranger moved forward a few more steps, firm now, body aligned, posture confident. It wasn't speed, it was control.
Ethan felt his eyes fill with tears. Not from worry, from pride. The German shepherd turned and walked back to him, sitting carefully at his side. The look said everything. He was still there. Whole. Ethan knelt down, hugging him gently. "You did it," he murmured. The test hadn't been only physical. Both had faced silent ghosts. Ranger overcame pain. Ethan overcame paralyzing fear. The field was still there. Wild. Indifferent. But now there were clear limits. Awareness. Choice. Ranger lay down in the shade again, exhausted, but calm. Ethan stayed by his side, watching the sky. Some trials don't ask for extreme strength. They ask for enough trust to take.
Chapter 19. Gratitude. Time passed without hurry. The weeks that followed brought a lighter routine, almost silent. Ranger was already walking confidently around the yard, always under Ethan's watchful eye. His legs still carried a slight stiffness, but there was no visible pain, just a subtle reminder of what they had faced together. Ethan had changed more than he had imagined. He no longer walked distractedly. He watched the ground, the wind, the sounds. He had learned to respect the land, not as an enemy, but as something that demanded constant attention. One afternoon, as the sun turned the dry earth golden, Ethan sat on the porch with a mug of coffee in his hands. Ranger lay down beside him, resting his body against him naturally. The simple contact carried a deep meaning. "Thank you," Ethan said softly. It was not a momentary thank you. It was something deeper. For life, for the chance, for the silent lesson.
Ranger lifted his head for a moment, as if recognizing the tone. Then he closed his eyes again, calm. He didn't need words. He never had. Ethan thought about how many times he had gone through life without noticing small signs of care. Now, everything seemed clearer. Gratitude had transformed the way he saw the world. The field remained vast. The nights were still silent. But solitude had given way to something stronger, conscious presence. Ranger breathed calmly, alive, strong, present. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the wind touch his face. There was no more hurry. There was no more escape. Gratitude, he realized, was not just a feeling. It was a way of living.
Chapter 20. The Silent Guardian. The sun rose slowly over the field, spreading golden light across the land that had once nearly taken everything from them. Ethan walked slowly through the yard, attentive, aware of every step. Beside him, Ranger moved steadily, body aligned, posture confident. There was no hurry. There was no challenge. Only presence. The scar on the German shepherd's leg was still visible. Small, discreet, but permanent. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just a mark. To Ethan, it was a daily reminder of what true loyalty meant. They stopped near the fence. The wind blew softly, carrying distant sounds of wildlife. Ranger raised his ears by instinct, assessed the surroundings, and relaxed. There was no threat, just the world following its natural course. Ethan knelt down and rested his hand on the dog's chest, feeling the calm rhythm of the heart that had once nearly stopped for him.
"You saved my life," he said serenely. Ranger moved his tail slowly. He didn't seek recognition. He never had. For him, protecting was simply existing. The field remained dangerous. It always would be. But now there was awareness, respect, and choice. Ethan no longer lived running from the world. He had learned to inhabit it with attention. As they walked back toward the house, Ethan realized something simple and profound. Not all heroes make noise. Some don't use words. Some simply observe, feel, and act when it matters most. Ranger paused for a moment, looking back, as if to confirm that Ethan was there. Then he moved on. The silent guardian didn't need to lead. It was enough to walk alongside. And in that place of warm earth and ancient silence, two lives continued together, not bound by fear, but by gratitude, by courage, and by a bond that no threat could ever break.